Welcome, everyone, for our conversation today about Go Global. I've got a wonderful guest today. His name is Dr. Dexter Shurney. It is so great to be with you, Dexter. Thank you so much for being my guest today. Both of us are
Thank
a
you.
little bit kind of betwixt and between planes, trains, and automobiles. Dexter, I know you are in the airport and you are on your way to where are you traveling to?
To Oakland, California. Yeah. Oakland,
I'm sorry, you cut
you
out for just a
froze.
moment. So,
You
where?
froze. Yeah. But I'm,
Oh,
I'm
I
on my
did.
way to
Okay.
Oakland. Yes. Thank you.
On your way to Oakland. Excellent. So I am coming from Houston, and I am in a hotel lobby here. We had some issues with the connection, so I might get a little glitchy at times. Dexter, you might be a little glitchy at times, but we're here. So for the rest of you who are coming in, I see we already have some comments about how excited people are to talk with you, Dexter. If you wouldn't mind sharing where you're coming from so we can get a sense as to where everybody's coming from. And just as we always do these, please share your questions and comments along the way, and Dexter would love to respond to those. So let me
Absolutely.
introduce you more formally, Dexter. You are the president of the Blue Zones Wellbeing Institute, and you also serve as Adventist Health's Chief Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. You're co-author of Integrating Wellness into Your Disease Management Practice, and you also have a lot of experience in employer benefit design with your work with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, as well as your work with Cummins and Vanderbilt and many others. So, Dexter, welcome. So
Thank you.
tell us a little bit about your story and how you got into the work that you're doing now. And we can see now some of where people are coming from. So we got Mark here coming from Maryland. So for those of you who are joining us, again, please share where you're coming from. We've got Shanar coming from New York. Welcome, Jennifer from Florida. Um, Welcome to all of you, and Kristen from Bozeman, Montana. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more coming in. So, Dexter,
All
go ahead
right.
and share with us a little bit about your story and how you got started in this.
Sure. So, I started off life as a general surgeon. And I quickly realized that a lot of the things that I was treating were actually preventable. So I went into preventive medicine, and here I am, a preventive medicine physician. And as I got into my late 30s and 40s, I started to develop all of these issues like high blood pressure and prediabetes. And then it was at that time that I learned about lifestyle medicine, used myself as an N of one, and actually saw some fantastic results. And from that point on, I was sold.
And I love the idea that you started with yourself and n equals one in
Yeah,
your case. What were some of the things that what would you say were some of the things that you did that made the biggest difference?
probably the biggest difference was my diet.
Hmm.
I was one of those barbecue backyard chefs on the weekend, and I actually became vegetarian, and it made a huge difference. I came off all of my cholesterol medications. I came off my blood pressure. I'm no longer pre-diabetic, and in the process, I lost about 65 pounds, even though I was eating more than before. I was always full, but I was actually losing weight because I was eating things that were healthy, nutritious, high in fiber. So I was satisfied. I wasn't feeling like I was hungry, but the weight gradually kind of came away. It was really a phenomenal thing.
Well, I love that you really certainly are a great example of somebody who actually walks the walk as opposed to just talking the talk. So, I have to ask you before we dive into this conversation around going global, I have to ask you about this recent report that was issued by the American Academy of Pediatrics, which suggests that there is not a link between lifestyle and obesity, in this case, specifically childhood obesity. And in fact, most frighteningly summed up by Aaron Kelly, co director of the Center for Pediatric Obesity Medicine at the University of Minnesota, quote, obesity is not a lifestyle problem. It is not a lifestyle disease. It predominantly emerges from biological factors. End of quote.
Yeah.
So, share with us your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, just think about it. I mean, intuitively, does that make any sense? I challenge anyone to go back and look at yearbooks from the 1950s, the 1960s, and even the 1970s And what you will notice is that most of us were thin. Go back and look at a Life magazine or a Time magazine. Most of us were thin. And it's only been over the last 30, 20 years that we've had this epidemic of obesity. And so I would challenge anybody to tell me that the genes, our genetic code, has changed over the last 30 years that would cause us now to have this genetic issue. No, what has changed over the last 30 years, as we all know, is lifestyle. We don't move as much. The foods that we eat are more processed. They're ultra processed, actually. 60, 70% of people's diets are now ultra processed foods. And this is what's really driving the obesity issue because those foods are very high in calories. They're calorie dense. And so that's what's really causing it. We don't sleep as much. Sleep is a big issue. The other thing I'll say about those processed foods is that they change our microbiome, our gut microbiome, and we know that plays a big role in our ability to maintain a healthy weight as well. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think that the reality is that people want an easy solution, and in this case, frighteningly, they're now this easy solution is surgery for these children, early intervention in the form of surgery as opposed to early intervention around lifestyle, and it's really shocking to me that we're moving to this. And I want to it looks like that Lana just submitted a question here. So does Dr. Shurney have any recommendations to shift from the pill to fix ills
I
about life?
do. Yeah, I do. And we
And
really have to concentrate more on the built environment. We can talk about more of this later. But, as I mentioned, over the last 30 years or so, our built environment has changed so much. Um, Oftentimes we look to the individual, tell the individual, you just have to try harder. You just have to have more willpower. That only works for about 20% of the population. And then the rest of us, after New Year's resolution, a week or so into it, we're already abandoning those goals, right? And so, but if we can change the built environment, and that's why I'm glad we have a lot of employers on the line because they also have an opportunity to do that. So I could say a lot more, but I know our time is short and I want to make sure we can get into some other things as well.
well, I think that that's a perfect segue to our conversation today, Dexter, which is again this topic of going global. And one of the things that I often remind the audiences that I work with is that it's not, if we look to the blue zones, those hotspots of longevity around the world, and you can share more about that. But it's not that those people are that much more motivated than the rest of us. They're not. It's just that they happen to have been lucky enough to have been born into a blue zone. So tell us a little bit more about just, if you could just give us kind of high level, kind of what are the blue zones and what are we seeing in the blue zones and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, so the blue zones, just quickly, those are the areas around the world originally found where people live to be well into their hundreds and they're healthy, they're happy, vibrant, they have a very high level of well being. And what Dan Buettner and the research team did originally, the Blue Zone team, is they tried to figure out why it was those folks were doing that. And these places are all over the world, but there's one actually in North America, and that's in California. So Southern California, Loma Linda is a blue zones. And so you might look at the other places like in Greece or Costa Rica, and you might say, well, those are paradises, and so therefore anybody would live to be 100 and be healthy. But Loma Linda is right outside of Los Angeles, about 60 miles out of LA, and it's not a paradise. I mean, I don't want to insult the people that live there, but it's your typical American town with congestion, pollution, smog, a lot of stress, a lot of fast food, and those kinds of things. And what Dan and these researchers found is that Loma Linda and these other blue zones shared 9 things in common. He calls those the Power 9. And these are some of the things that we can do. And it's really about the built environment and how we think about things. And we can do these intentionally ourselves as well.
And that's really the practice of going global, which is cross borders to acquire best practices And in fact, how might even look within borders and in fact take a multicultural lens toward that, to apply those things that can actually work, and
That
practices that have been long standing.
that's exactly right. So what you find if you look at those 9 commonalities among these communities, they are similar, but they're different. So, for example, you may find the people in Greece are moving because they're herding sheep and they're walking up mountains. You may find the people in Okinawa that are on fishing boats and they're, working that way. But the commonality is physical activity, right? So it's similar, but it's different depending on where you're located, and we can learn from each other in that way as well, and adopt these things. And so, yeah, it's a wonderful way to look at this, and it also makes it not as hard, not as difficult. It takes the mystery out of it in a lot of ways.
Well, one of the things that I love about how people, it's not just that people are moving, but it's how people are moving. And specifically in that it's about natural movement as opposed to going to the gym. And one of the things that I find so shocking is that on the one hand, wellness is the fastest growing industry. There's billions or trillions of dollars going toward wellness today around the world. We talk about it all the time. And yet our health and well-being seems to be going in reverse. So with all the Pelotons and all the fitness facilities and the Soul Cycle, we're going in reverse. So it's really more about the natural incorporation of well-being. So talk a little bit more about how we can learn from these blue zones around making it more natural.
That's such a good point. We know from research that if you're to exercise for 60 minutes, which is great, right? I wish everyone would exercise for 60 minutes. But if you spend the rest of your time, the rest of your day sitting, you almost negate all the benefits of that exercise. It's still better to do it. I don't want to discourage anybody. So what we find from these natural movements is that they're moving throughout the day. It's not just, I'm going to go to the gym for 60 minutes, but throughout the day, there are these opportunities to move. And that's really what is so good about it. The other thing too is that they're moving with a purpose, right? If I'm out there fishing on a fishing boat, I have a purpose, and I get the satisfaction. I can check off the endorphins, in terms of my catch. If I'm walking the sheep up the hill, there's a reason I'm doing that. So it also combines this purpose with movement, which I think is also something that we miss oftentimes when we just go to the gym.
And I think also one of the things that we tend to do is we want to separate out all these different elements of well-being as opposed to seeing the connections between the two. So what you're talking about right now is that we're moving, but we're also fulfilling our purpose because we're moving with purpose, and we're also moving with other people typically. And so
That's
again, there's the intersection between those two. Again, social well-being being an important part of that. Okay, it looks like we've got a question that came in here from Perry. What's the plan to leverage technology to enhance healthcare in non-blue zones while incorporating DEI initiatives? And I'm so glad, Perry. Thank you for bringing up the question around the intersection between going global, well-being, and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, one of the things we find, Perry, is that if you get this right, then you actually start to diminish the health inequities that we see so often. So, for example, going back to Southern California blue zones, if you look at the data around some of the Black participants compared to the others in that cohort, their health disparities start to come together as they live more and more of this blue zone lifestyle. So that's really encouraging as well. So we always talk about, your zip code is more important than your genetic code and that kind of thing. But this is actually proof positive that if you surround people with this nurturing environment and allowing them to move naturally and eat healthy foods and things like that, the disparities actually come down quite quickly. And so the other thing too is what's the technology piece to this? I think one of the opportunities is technology, artificial intelligence could help us with understanding the intersectionality of individuals. We're not homogeneous. You look at me and you say, oh, Dexter is a Black male. That's true, but there's more to me than just that, right? Now, where do I live? What do I do? What's my social economic? and what's my religious background, right? And so you put all this together, that's a portrait of me. And I think technology can help us do that, because then we can start to pinpoint and personalize the things that will work for me versus working for Laura or working for another person that might look like me, but all those other things that I mentioned could be totally different.
And I think it's interesting, Dexter, that you talk about kind of it's on the one hand, we need to think more systemically around environment and culture, more from the outside in, if you will. And at the same time, we need to think about becoming even more personalized than we are right now.
Yes, it's the
And
and.
right. So Lana shared here that she loved this move with purpose. I also want to share the question that Kristen Rainey submitted here about alcohol. So I'm also intrigued with this because I know that one of the best practices in the power of nine is wine at five. So tell us a little bit about this recent research that's coming out showing that actually no alcohol is probably the healthiest way to go. And specifically, Kristen is asking, there's been some interesting coverage about this, and that any amount of alcohol is bad for our health. Do you think that red wine, many of us thought was good for our health in small amounts, is actually not a contributor to Blue Zone's residents' well-being, but in spite of it?
Yeah, and I don't want to get in front of the researchers on this, but this is my opinion. My opinion is that it's the socialization. So, for example, I mentioned the Southern California Blue Zone folks. They tend to be Seventh Day Adventists, and they drink no wine. So that is one of the elements that does not contribute to their longevity. And so what we're starting to think is that it's really the socialization. And so these countries or these blue zones where you do see the wine at five, it's really the socialization. They're not drinking a lot of it, by the way, but yeah, it's more the socialization and the benefits that you get from red wine. We already know that you can get from just healthy grape juice, and you don't really have to have the alcohol content.
Got it. And it is interesting how wine really can be an important socializer, I think, in a lot of cultural contexts. So we got a question here from Mark Campbell. How does exposure to the natural world correlate with longer living in blue zone areas?
Oh, absolutely. And so this is probably one of the things you may not see as much of in the Southern California cohort, but you just definitely see it in the others. But I will tell you is that Southern California cohort, when they get a chance, they do spend time in nature. They go to the mountains. Big Bear is not that far. If they want to go skiing, they can go down to the beach. If they want to go into the water, so even though they're in Southern California, they do have these outlets that they can go to enjoy nature. But those others do, and we do know that being in nature has a very positive impact on your moods and just how well you feel, right? So
And I think that that's a tricky issue, Dexter, and I'd love your thoughts around this because one of the tips that we hear a lot around better health and well-being is, quote, to get out into nature. And yet, if we consider that 100 million Americans don't have easy access to decent green spaces, again, how do we resolve that issue to really give everybody that opportunity to have that access to nature because of its health benefits?
so that question and the question before that was dealing with wine. Hold on a second. My computer's trying to restart. I don't want that. Okay. Um, Not good. Okay. That question and the one before actually caused me to think about something else. And so I mentioned that there are 9 elements that contribute to this longevity and well being. And what I'm also going to say is that you don't necessarily have to do all of them. So the folks in Southern California may not be able to get in nature as much every day like these other folks are. The folks in these other places are having a little wine, and the folks in Southern California are not. But the socialization is there. So what I'm saying is that do what you can do. All of these things are synergistic, and they add up to something that's bigger.
Mm.
And so if you can't do one, or if you are doing one, if you are having a little wine at 5, well, if you're moving, if you're sleeping, if you have less stress and you're doing all these other things, that probably is not a big deal. So think about how different people in different areas can actually do what they can, and then just do that. And don't worry, don't fret so much about the other things that you can't do.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing worse than worrying ourselves well, if you will. We've got some other good questions that have come in here. One from Shurney. Is there a way to measure Blue Zone success? Is there a tool? And the
There,
question has
there,
been posted there. Yeah, go ahead.
there is. And the way that the Blue Zones are set up is that when we go into communities, we ask the community, what does success look like for you? And every community is working on something, right? And so what we do is we try to take the learnings, the best practices of Blue Zones, and then apply them to other communities and try to then check off the boxes that that community thinks is most important. So that's really how it's measured. So there are some core things that people look at for sure, but there are also these individualized things that different cities or regions want to do for themselves. And the nice thing about Blue Zones is that there's something there for everyone.
And I think that this actually is a nice segue to a question from Hung Woo here, which is, are there best practices you can share on how to approach cultures and communities who may be resistant to healthier lifestyles? Actually, if we can get the question from Hung Woo instead. Yeah, there we go. So best practices you can share on how to approach cultures and communities where there may be some resistance to healthier lifestyles.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying, is that people have to understand what's in it for them and what's in it for their community. And there are certainly best practices that you can borrow. The build community is one that I always talk about. And so how do you develop it such that people will move naturally, as you said? How do you bring people together? And you find common threads to actually do that, to bring the people together. We live in such a polarized society. We have to find the things that we agree upon and bring us together on those. And once we then start to work with each other, we find that, Laura might have a different opinion than Dexter on X, Y, and Z, but we really agree about this. And because we agree about this, we worked on this. Now I know that Laura's not such a bad person. Dexter's okay as well. And so that's how we start to do it. It's not, you just flip a switch. It takes a little intention. It takes a little time, but it's very doable.
And one of the things that I love that you're sharing right now, Dexter, is really, to me, it reminds me of the longstanding Harvard study around longevity, which has found that the number one, if there's any silver bullet to well-being, it's social relationships. And so it's really about starting with those connections first and then starting to build well-being from there. So we've got a question here from Sally. Can we work to simulate more natural colors and environments when there are many without access to nature, or live in areas that the climate at times might not make it easy to get outdoors?
I love that. I don't know if I have the exact answer, but I will tell you that people are researching that. I know of some organizations that are using virtual reality to simulate nature. And they even bring smells into it, right? So if you're, visualizing trees, you can smell the trees at the same time. If you're visualizing the ocean, you might smell the ocean. So to be determined would be what I'd say. But people are really looking at that, and we'll know probably in the next year or two whether or not that artificial creation of nature has the same impact as actually being in nature. I assume that it probably will move us in that direction, but it's kind of like food, the supplement's never as good as the food, right? And the real deal is probably never as good as something simulated, but we can approximate and try to get as close as we can for those that aren't able to get there themselves.
Yeah. We've got a question here also from Pradeep. How do you ensure the mental well-being practices of Blue Zone community to other communities?
How do you ensure? Well, I think it goes back to who we're relating with. I think if you look at all of those Power 9, you can't help but have better well-being. We know that when you move, you actually release endorphins. We know that the foods that you eat can actually promote anxiety or decrease anxiety based on the inflammation they might cause in the brain, or how they might affect the blood flow to the brain and things like that. So if you do these things, I don't think it's possible not to have a better well-being. And then you throw on top of that the relationships and the socialization that we just mentioned, and being outside in nature, in the sun or whatever. I don't see how you can't do that in terms of.
Yeah. And one of my favorite studies is one that came out of Sapienza University in Rome, in which they found that movement actually primes us to socially connect with one another. It releases chemicals that make us more likely to connect. And I just want to add here, Mark Campbell noted that there's a biophilic design as a quickly growing field. So this is something for all of us to keep in mind. So thank you, Mark, for that contribution. So Dexter, I cannot believe that we are coming up on the end of our time here together. And I was wondering, in this kind of ranging conversation that we've had around these best practices and how we can go global to enhance our own well-being as individuals, but also as being part of community units. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways for our guests here today? What are the top 3 things you'd like them to leave with?
Well, the first thing is start where you can. Start where you can. Don't be discouraged that if you look at the 9 and you say I can't do all of these things, so therefore I'm not going to do anything. No, start what you can, because as I said, it's synergistic and it builds. The other thing is that we shouldn't be so proud. As Americans, I mean, everyone has national pride, right? And we think about, well, we live in the United States and we have the best, cleanest water. We have the best hygiene and these kinds of things. And everybody wants to be like us. What can we learn from anybody? I mean, we have it all, right? Well, I think we're starting to learn that perhaps we don't, there's some things we can learn from others. And so I think we need to be more open about other cultures and societies and say, what can we learn from each other, right? Not just that we always have the answer. So that's something that takes a little time to figure out, but I think if we have that open attitude, that would be very helpful to us. And then the other thing too is, it kind of gets back to my first point, is that baby steps in this area are so important. And it doesn't matter where you start. If you're looking at the nutrition aspects, if you're looking at the dietary or the nutrition aspects, baby steps. So you may not be able to do everything. And even in those ones that you can do, don't be discouraged that you have to start with some baby steps. The good thing is all of this stuff accelerates and gains momentum.
So start where you can. We shouldn't be so proud. and instead should be open to the idea that maybe there's a lot that we can learn by crossing borders and even by going within, but applying that openness to diverse thoughts and approaches. And then this idea of baby steps. And in fact, I often ask people to consider to little by little keep doing a lot. And so the key is, as you were talking about exercise, instead of packing it all into 60 minutes, what if you did a little bit, but you did a lot of it? Getting up, for 2 minutes every hour may be better than that 60-minute intense workout.
That's exactly right. Just take a walk around the office, every 30 minutes or something if you can. And in this virtual world, we're not tied down necessarily to a conference room, and we can do that. So take advantage of it.
So Dexter, how can people stay in touch with you?
Dexter at bluezones.com. Easy.
Okay.
You don't even have to remember my last name. Yeah, just.
And you're also active on LinkedIn. Are there any other social media platforms where people can follow your work?
I wish I could say yes, but I am on other platforms, but I'm not that active. My adult children remind me of that all the time. So, just send me an email, LinkedIn. That's probably the best.
Old school is good. I'm old school as well, so I totally embrace that.
By the way,
So
I heard flip phones are coming back. I heard that by millennials. Yeah.
Yes, as well as old school digital cameras. So I love that
There
all
you
the
go.
old school stuff is coming back. So I want to thank you, Dexter, so much for being our guest today in this really good conversation about going global. I want to remind everyone that we'll be reconvening next month, February 22nd. I'll be having a conversation with Dan Conrad, who is the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Dakota, and we'll be talking more about how top leaders can really lead the movement within their organization. But Dexter, you have been awesome. And I'm so grateful to have had you as my guest. And I can tell by all the wonderful questions that have come in that everybody else has really enjoyed having you as our guest as well. So thank you so much. And to everybody who joined us today, thank you so much. We'll see you in a month. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.